Welcome back, Saucers.
Welcome, and doesn't it feel good to be in a brand new world?
This is, we're recording this Sunday the 8th, and the Lord and voters have spoken. But we'll get into that. We'll have our own little separate, I mean, we get into it a little bit in this episode, but we will dive in shortly on our thoughts about everything, because what a week.
Yep.
Anywho, we have the pleasure of talking to Ayten Salahi today. She's a clinical nutritionist, planetary nutritionist, I would say, right?
Yeah, that's what she's called.
Who does amazing work and has a great story of basically how she got into that work. And to basically summarize it without giving too much away, it's capitalism and racism. Spoiler alert, big shocker. But we talk about everything today, and I'm so excited to clean water, access to clean water, intersectional food.
Yeah, how food is politicized and why.
Mm-hmm. So sit back, relax, and get ready to get educated. Thank you so much, Ayten, for being here today.
So happy to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Yes, welcome. We are so jazzed to be talking about what we're talking about today. But like to jump into it, do you want to tell our audience, like in like a sentence or two, a little teaser of what your SOS moment is?
My SOS moment happened when I was at a medical conference in 2016, and there was a protest happening with this hacker group. Mm-hmm. And instead of really siding or resonating with the medical device company that I worked with at the time, I found myself totally on the side of the hackers. So that was kind of the moment where I was like, ooh, I am not in the right place. And then the 2016 election is really what pushed me over the edge to kind of reroute my life completely.
Yes. Oh, well, that's relatable. The first one, no. And that's why I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah. So
yeah.
So would, like, for example, just to give a little background to what you just referenced for our listeners, were you already doubting the integrity, for lack of a better word, of the work that you were doing with that medical device company, or what were the hackers doing? What was their side?
Yeah. So I would not say that I was doubting the integrity at all. I do think that, like the devices that this company creates are life-saving and life-changing. But the part that I always got hung up on was, like, why is this so inaccessible for most people? Why is it so dependent on the type of insurance that a person has in order to afford this type of life-saving medical device? So it wasn't that I was doubting the integrity. I understand how these things work, and medical device companies are bound by certain regulations to, get products to market in a safe way. But my question is always not like, I'm less interested in that process, as strange as it sounds, and I'm more interested in the question of, like, why is this not something that is accessible to everybody if we know that it's life-saving? And what's the process to make it more accessible, So should I share a little bit more about what happened with that?
Yeah, well, I'm like super interested in like how the hackers were able to do what they were doing.
Yeah.
What were they doing though?
They didn't actually. So they, to be clear, like, they did nothing that's illegal, as we all know. Protesting and showing up somewhere for peacefully protest is completely perfectly legal, as much as some he who shall not be named people would like to like for that to be illegal. So what happened was I was at a medical device, or I was at this medical conference with a medical device company that I was working at the time. I knew for a while that I was kind of there just to get my footing in the world. This was right after undergrad. I worked for 5 years. I needed to learn a little bit more about where I wanted to go. And so it was kind of like, it took me 5 years really to figure out like what the next step was going to be for me. But at this conference, there was this really cool group of hackers that came and basically said that the algorithm that we use for the medical device that we've created, which is an insulin pump, should be open source so that other people can find cheaper ways to make that pump for people. And, following all of the appropriate legal channels to do so, the process that we use and the algorithm that we use should be open source. And I was like, Y'all, they're right. What do you guys think? Like, they're totally right. So they were protesting, and I found myself at a table with a bunch of executives in the medical device industry, and they're all talking about how horrible that was and how dangerous it is, that kind of thinking. And I was like, I completely disagree. I mean, open source, like pharmaceutical formularies and like research results is the way of the future, and I think keeping industries siloed off by claiming ownership over different types of technologies is what's stopping us from being able to make life-saving therapeutics and technologies accessible to everybody. So that was really the moment where I was like, oh my God, I felt like I couldn't say anything because I was like such a small up and comer there sitting with this group of executives. And B, I was like, looking at this group, and I was like, there's a lot that's very impressive about them. But at the same time, do I want to be you in 20 years? No.
Right.
I don't want to live a life that's going to lead me to adopt those same views. And I know that like something just shook me at my core. And that was that.
Wow.
That's crazy because you don't really think about it that much, but it makes so much sense. And would you say, I mean, this is probably an obvious question, like, why companies do that? Why isn't it open source? And like, I guess the answer is, and I'm sure you'll agree, is just capitalism at its finest.
100% capitalism at its finest. It's exactly that. And it's about having a competitive advantage. And in this country that we are built on this concept that you have to be competing, you can't be uplifting one another. In order to get ahead, you have to tear down the next person. And that's kind of like the foundational philosophy in this capitalist society, at least when it comes to industry competition. So when I actually did ask one of my mentors at that company that I was at, like, why are you down with open source? Is it something that you would consider? And they were like, absolutely not, because the only reason that, and I don't agree with this statement, but their thinking was the only reason that businesses even innovate is because of that drive for competition. And to me,
what?
Yeah, the drive for competition and the drive to do better than the next guy and the drive to make more money. And so all of those ideas are counter to what I believe a functional society looks like in the future. So I was like, I gotta go.
Well, and speaking of a functional society in the future, you also mentioned the 2016 election as, part of your SOS moment. So you want to expand on that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure you guys can relate.
Yep.
That night,
I'm still in a fog.
Oh my God, I know. It's an emotional hangover.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that night started off with me and my friends drinking some wine and like watching Hillary like take the lead. And then just at a certain point, as you all remember, everything turned. And I went home and I was like, holy shit, that just happened. There are so many issues that we're going to need to unpack. There's so like whatever damage this person and his administration does is going to take a lot of work to undo and replace. And by this point, I had basically for 4 years been like exploring my interests and what my passions really were. And I knew that it wasn't, designing and testing the most top of the line type of like medical product. It was helping people to achieve the most basic human necessities, because that is more, it's just more in line with my family's story. It's just more, it's more humble and it's more universalist. And what I eventually landed on was food, because what is more universal than the need for food and the need for things like clean water? So I wanted to explore, why is it? Why is food so political? Because it is. Right. It is political. And what would a society look like where things like food and water and healthcare services and housing were accessible to everybody?
And that's interesting too, because you went from this job that I would assume it would pay well into something that could be kind of risky. Like, what was that like to kind of shift and kind of untrain your brain to want to be in that competitive environment?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You completely nailed it. I went from a well-paying job to basically like using all of my savings to go into this fight that where there is no guarantee of making money at the end of the day. And then that's not the goal that's pushing me to work hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think what made it easy was knowing that my motivation was not to go out and be a millionaire, because I don't even necessarily think that millionaires and billionaires should exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And yeah, and so I think like taking that time to like be in a place where I did not feel like I fit, like my values and my philosophies in life were not aligned with working in, you know, an industry like that. I knew that I wanted to work in something that had the possibility of improving many people's lives in a way that's accessible and affordable. And I also knew that I was down to really tackle those difficult conversations where you have to dissect why it is that, in the example of this in the medical device industry, why is it that this device is not accessible and affordable, and like really get into it and not just have an idealistic response to it, but know why. What are the legal processes and the regulatory processes that we have to go through on the industry side of things, but also let's tear down all that bullshit and really get to the root of why those structures even exist and why they're kind of built to prevent people from having equal access to health.
Racism.
At the end of the day. Racism, yes, ma'am. So those are the conversations that I was more interested in getting to that. You know? So
yes, because I wanted. So one of the terms, one of the terms that I had heard, I didn't actually know I don't know what it means. Alyssa said the same, but intersectional food. And how would you define that?
So I would say that intersectionality and thinking about all elements of society in an intersectional way is the way of the future. We are moving away from thinking of things as silos and independent issues, and viewing and really understanding how they're connected to different parts of social identity and the structures that make our society function. So when I say that, you know, food is an intersectional issue, what I'm really saying is that food is political. And if you don't think that it's political, that is your privilege that's preventing you from being able to acknowledge that it is. And that it's also multidimensional. So in the intersectionality of food, you know, it's complicated, but it's essentially a way that we can draw the web of the way that food is connected with social identity, like your race, class, income status, gender, and sexuality. And then another layer, the environmental determinants, like where you were born, you know, the quality of the food and the air and the water in the place that you live. And then really understand the way that these different elements interact for different groups of people, to understand truly that there are groups that are being actively oppressed by society using these elements as the tool for oppression. So by making food less accessible for communities of color and housing less accessible for those communities, clean air, clean water, you're oppressing those groups, and it's a choice. There are policy decisions that create that oppression and keep it in place. So when I say that, you know, when I talk about food being intersectional, what I mean is when I think of food, I think about social identity, and I think about structural inequities like racism, classism, sexism, and how all of that together results in there being unequal access to food and differing health outcomes that are a result of that.
That's so interesting that like even grocery stores have like elite status, like Whole Foods. And then
Trader
there's like
Joe's.
Sprouts, Trader Joe's, and there's Vons and Ralph's, and like,
oh my God, Erewhon.
Oh my God. I don't,
Well,
the
there was
fact
like
that like people, the access, it's literally sustenance and nutrients for our body. It's nothing more. Yeah, it can be exciting and cooking and food is beautiful. But like, that's just a thing we all need to survive. And the fact that it's a thing of like, I'm going to go, I have all my Whole Food stuff here, and people, it's a status symbol where you buy your nutrients.
Yes,
And
it is.
and even in a city like LA, I was following this girl who was doing this. I think it's TikToks. Don't judge me, but of
would never.
of
TikTok is so lit right now. By the way,
is.
I'm
lit. Oh my God, I'm screaming into the mic. But this girl was just breaking down everywhere about how even in a city as blue and as liberal and a paradise like Los Angeles, breaking down just by Trader Joe's alone what the food deserts are actually like in low-income areas and like where specifically like they're placing these Trader Joe's. And it's so sad. And if it's happening here, it's happening everywhere. And you take it for granted. You 100%. You don't think about it.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's kind of like the deeper you go with these questions and with this line of inquiry, the more you realize that there is so much work to be done to ensure that all people have access to the most basic life necessities in order to, I don't know, if you, we can all tweet about it, we can all Instagram about it, we can post shit about it. But, you know, when the 2016 election happened, I was like, it's the time to be about it. I need to switch. I moved. I shifted my entire life. I applied for graduate school. I studied food policy and applied nutrition, learned how to run nutrition programs, and now I'm doing clinical nutrition at Mass General so that I can learn both the clinical side and the policy side. And I'm just like all things food so we can just stop decolonize food.
That's amazing.
Decolonize food.
Well, and also another aspect that I'm curious about is how does what we eat affect climate change the most?
So this is a really good question, and I think this has fortunately been coming up a lot more in more common circles, but the world's food system is responsible for about a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases, which are the planet warming greenhouse gases, and that's each year. So there are four main ways that food contributes to climate change, and the first is deforestation. So in heavily forested areas, you hear about this a lot in the context of the Amazon. Large swaths of land have to be cleared in order for livestock farms to be placed there. And the result of that is a decrease or an increase in the amount of carbon that's being emitted into the atmosphere and a reduction in carbon sequestration from trees. So that's a huge, huge problem. Another one is the methane from cows, sheep, and goats as they digest their food, but that's actually not as big of an issue as the fossil fuel combustion that's required to transport those fuels long distances in this global economy. So, and then also, you know, those fossil fuels, they're not just used for transportation, but they're also used to operate farm machinery, to make fertilizers, and those also generate emissions. So outside of food, there are many other factors that can result in greenhouse gas emissions increasing and the temperature of the world also increasing in lockstep with the GHGs, but food is a major, major contributor, and the through line is very clear, and I think people are becoming more interested to learn how their individual and collective actions can help to reduce our effect on climate change.
Yeah. Is veganism and vegetarianism, in your opinion, a huge help to that? Or is that like, you know, I'm interested on your thoughts on like that kind of leads into diet culture or what people, it's a whole thing, but like, what are your opinions on all of that?
And how do you communicate that too to people that are very much like, no, I'm a meat eater, stop it, leave me alone, you know?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is like, I tell everybody who like goes into this line of thinking with food, like drop your judgment, drop the judgment right now, drop it yesterday. There are going to be people who don't want to give up their burger and their steak, and that's okay. That's fine. Don't waste your energy trying to like change everybody. There are some people who are legitimately interested in like, you know, they might say I'm an omnivore, but I'm really concerned about climate change and I want to learn about like some things that I can do at home, some simple things that I can start doing in order to reduce my impact. And so those people I work with a lot, and those people come to me a lot to figure out where the first place is to start. And it truly is like the amount of meat and dairy on your plate or in your house in a day, it does make a difference. It adds up. But also, individual action and holding individuals like to blame for climate change is not the way to go either. If you are a person who is interested in making individual changes, bravo, because that really, really adds up. And if all of society starts making those changes, you can imagine what a huge impact that we would have in slowing climate change and potentially even reversing it if we take on some larger collective actions.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's the communities in the plant-based world that shame people for not taking action on their plate. I understand where they're coming from, I really do, but it turns people away from the work and it's a deterrent. Yeah. And so my goal is to just bring as many people into just learning about the way that food and climate are interact with one another on a daily basis, and get excited about the ways that you can actually try to make a change. And so I talked to people about what's called a planetary health plate. There was a report in 2017 with the EAT Foundation and the Lancet Commission called the Planetary Health Report. And in that report, they talk about something called a planetary health plate. And if you can visualize your plate, if you cut the plate in half and you've got, your veggies and greens on half of the plate, you can have whatever, oil on that, that's fine, seasonings. You have a little bit of other oils, nuts and seeds on that plate. You can even have a small serving of meat. You can have a small serving of meat, but just not more than a 4-ounce serving more than one time a day. So this report kind of showed that there is a way that you can have a positive environmental impact with what you eat without completely cutting out animal products. But it also showed that the diet that is healthier for both the planet and for people has less animal products in it. So you don't have to give it up, but cutting down really will be an improvement on your health and the health of the planet.
Well, I feel better about that. I mean, I think we've been really conscious about the meat that we consume, but still there is with everything. And we had a sustainability advisor on before, and it was a lot. It's pretty overwhelming when you think about it, because it's like you can never do enough. So I think that overwhelming mentality kind of puts a wall up where you're just like, if I can't even do this, or I can't transition to reusable feminine hygiene products, then everything's a waste and I shouldn't even bother,
Oh my gosh. Yes. Everybody gets caught in this all or nothing mentality. And I get it, because I did that too. And it's the number one thing that you should do if you want to burn yourself out and freak out and stop whatever course of action you are on. So it's pick one thing. And if you were to pick one thing that would be the best for your health and for the planet, it would be consuming less red meat and dairy, just a little bit less per week. So if that means you're having it a little bit less one day of the week, that's awesome. Maybe in the future that turns into 2 days in the week, but don't even think that far ahead. Just focus on the one goal and get to the place where it's so easy. It's like breathing,
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say I was watching a documentary on Netflix a while back, and it was talking about how of all the regional diets, the Mediterranean diet is scientifically proven to be to have be the healthiest for humans, in the sense that the life expectancy is longer. And I thought that was interesting because, and I know everybody my household growing up, we rarely ate meat. We weren't vegetarian per se, but my mom incredible cook and made all these international dishes. And it was mostly, we'd have chicken sometimes, but it was mostly beans and legumes and vegetables. And that was my normal. And that's still how I don't eat a lot of meat. If anything, I could easily go pescatarian and go from there. But what I think is interesting is, growing up and then being at friends' houses, or people I know now as an adult, where it's not a full, complete meal unless most of your plate is filled up with some meat substance. If it's a vegetable, it's a side. And if it's this is a side, this is a side. The main part is the meat. And that's an American mentality, especially a Midwestern mentality. I have a lot of family from Nebraska too, but it's just what? How do we reprogram? That doesn't actually, sometimes, you just want a big juicy steak, but that's not most times.
It's pretty all American.
And it's interesting what we think. Even the food pyramid when we were growing up, You know,
Yeah.
it's like most of what you consume should be this, and at the top was the fruits and veggies towards the top, and that was like the lesser portion, and
and like
I don't know.
bread and
Yes,
pasta
bread.
and milk at the bottom. Yeah, the food pyramid has, as you know, like been completely debunked, and there's something
Yeah.
called
So
My
funny.
Plate now, which is like the modernized version of that, and it
Okay, I
doesn't look
didn't know
that
that.
different. Yeah, and that the My Plate, it doesn't look very much different from what the Planetary Health Plate looks like. The difference is there's even more of a restriction on like the dairy and red
Mhm.
meat on the
Mhm.
Planetary Plate. And some other countries, the US, in 2015, there was a lot of commotion in the nutrition community to try to incorporate sustainability into the dietary guidelines for Americans. As you can imagine, I was very much in support of that. But it was struck down because of different lobbies in like the meat industry, the like beef
Yeah.
lobby, the dairy lobby. And okay, that's fine. Maybe the US is not there yet, but other countries have gotten on board with it. And countries even like Brazil, for example, they don't just include sustainability, but they include social factors to optimize your health when you eat a meal. They recommend eating with other people or like using it as a
Really?
time to disconnect from your. Yes. Isn't that incredible? So
That's
there's so many
beautiful.
different elements. Like we know that like chewing your food more and really focusing on your food and having like a mindful presence when you sit down to eat a meal, that improves your digestion, it improves your mood, it improves your metabolism. There's a lot of research that's starting to point in the direction that these like lifestyle factors really do have a measurable impact on your ability to metabolize food. Other countries are getting on board with it faster, and unfortunately, again, capitalism at its finest. We have a lot up against us in
We
the US
reign
to get things.
supreme in the theocracy of many things.
Yeah.
Especially
Yes.
when there's, like you're saying, it's not like it's this radical idea that no one's tried yet, and so this is why America's hesitant. Like you said, there are countries actively doing it and succeeding. There's an entire blueprint from countries that are doing it that we could just adopt, but it's this. But I mean, that's a whole other thing.
Well, I wonder
so
too.
the good thing with
yeah.
that though is that every 5 years the DGAs get reviewed again. The dietary guidelines for Americans are reviewed again.
Oh.
So people are bringing it up again and fighting to get sustainability incorporated into the DGAs.
Well, I'm actually curious too, before we let you go, about access to clean water as well. Because, I mean, we're recording this right after the election. That's why we're still in a fog and just blissfully happy. But with those results, I was very interested in Michigan specifically because Flint, I was kind of disappointed in how Flint, even though we got Michigan, and how Flint voted specifically, obviously, with white people. And Flint still doesn't have clean water. Why
Correct.
do you think there's still a disconnect with things like that and connecting it to the failed policies or just lack thereof of 45?
Of course, I mean, the simple answer is it comes down to we had a racist administration and they did not care to address the fact that there was an entire community of largely people of color who were still being poisoned with their water. Another issue there is that 45 made it almost impossible for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to accomplish anything. He had his people go onto the EPA website and remove scientific reports that referenced issues related to Flint, Michigan, referenced issues of climate change. He literally had the term climate change removed from every possible place where it used to be on the EPA website. And that's erasure. And it's not just erasure of science, it's erasure of communities of color. It's ignoring. It's a choice. It's a choice that was made. So I am very hopeful that the Biden-Harris administration will now take these issues much, much more seriously. But of course, very happy they were elected, but the work doesn't stop on our end. Communities of color really, really showed up for Biden and Harris, and it's time for them to return the favor by ensuring that there is some equity built in for basic life needs like food and clean water in those communities.
And that's the thing. Like, I'm really glad that we're able to have this conversation with you, because I think, especially with how divided, like completely divided our country is right now, and like it's us and them, and at the end of the day, like food being politicized just encourages that divisiveness, as opposed to like, look, communities of color and, you know, all these different populations tend to be Democrats, but when you remove all that from it, it's like those, like the work you're doing, you're not doing this with the intention of this is for Democrats. This is literally for all people, for Republicans,
human
for
right.
any human being. It's human rights, and that's I really have so much admiration for the fact that you just like up and left your job and followed this and are just and you're. I mean, I have so much admiration for you, and I'm really grateful that you came on here.
Thank you so
much.
Thank you. Are you kidding? I learned so much. This is great. Thank you.
Like, you guys are awesome. I could talk about this stuff all day with you. I can also just close out by saying that, like, probably the full, like, 6 months leading up to that shift where I left my job and went to go work on these issues, there was a lot of processing that had to happen, but if you should be uncomfortable. You should feel a little bit of discomfort when you're going into the direction that you're meant to be going into. That'll bring you more into alignment in whatever you think your purpose is or what your passions are.
Yes.
If you're not feeling a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit excited, chances are you're veering off in some direction.
So good.
So it felt like that. I was a little scared, but mostly excited. And like, that feeling is such a unique feeling. And I think that's how you know you're going in the right direction, you know?
Amen.
That's very, thank you, because that's a very on brand.
Very on brand.
Yeah. Yeah, you guys do a beautiful job of embodying that philosophy and like
thank you.
Inspiring others to do that. So thank you so much for having me on and for really doing the work of getting people in touch with what their purpose is. It's so important, and I'm really grateful that you guys are out there doing that.
Oh, thank you. You're amazing. Thank
you. You guys are awesome.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I learned so much.
I feel like we always say like this could go on for hours because it's real, and we have badass guests that like fucking and women.
Yeah.
Like the women that we have on our podcast. I mean, no shade, no shade to the men, but we have some badass women on our podcast, and it's like nuts.
It is, and also, you know, because we're approaching a year of our podcast, and you know, when you start, you're like, oh my God, who do we have for guests? And we have quickly the level of credibility and professionality that we're just lucky. The guests that we've had on, incredibly qualified, and you know,
I-10
not just
is
like
no exception.
Right. Yeah. And so with this conversation, well, first of all, I want to send everybody to her Instagram at planetary.nutritionist. So that's her social media. And she actually was telling us when we got off that she has started a nonprofit. She's in the process of starting her own nonprofit. And it's an anti-hunger and anti-climate change work that they do. And there are ways for everybody to get involved based on your level of how informed you are, what your views are. Basically, she was explaining to us that you send an email to her, explain where you stand on these issues, just how you feel and what you know, and then they find a place for you to get involved in this work. And the website is www.planetaryhealthcollective.org.
Yeah.
So head on over there.
Super non-judgmental either. Like, she totally understands how at whatever level you are at understanding what the process of fighting against anti-hunger and anti-climate change work. I think I pronounced that right, or phrase that right. But yeah, you don't have to be an expert, you know. It's just if you're curious and have that curiosity of just making the planet better and making yourself healthier in the long run, I definitely recommend you reach out to her. And another charity nonprofit that we want to shout out this episode is Project Drawdown. So it was founded in 2014, and it's a nonprofit organization that seeks to help the world reach drawdown. So it's the future point in time when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. Since the 2017 publication of the New York Times bestseller Drawdown, The organization has emerged as a leading resource for information and insight about climate solutions. They continue to develop that resource by conducting rigorous review and assessment of climate solutions, creating compelling and human communication across mediums, and partnering with efforts to accelerate climate solutions globally. So to learn more and donate, please visit drawdown.org. And yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Follow us on our Instagram at the SOS Pod. Follow us and subscribe on everywhere you find your podcast. That's Google, that's Apple, that is Spotify. Anywhere you find them, you can find us. And please rate and review. It helps us out. But I'm Alyssa. Oh, Alyssa Rosano. That's my full name.